Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that drifts somewhere between the mundane and the inexplicably strange. So, dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of tea, and let yourself settle in. Tonight we float over the quiet skies of California during the final years of the Second World War, and we'll meet an enormous, silent blimp that seemed to defy all reason, all explanation, and perhaps even gravity itself. This is the story of L-8, a U.S. Navy blimp that took off like any ordinary patrol airship, patrolled like any ordinary airship, and then somehow returned to land, perfectly intact, with no one aboard. No struggle, no crash, just empty seats where two pilots should have been, as if the craft itself had grown tired of carrying human weight and simply let them vanish. It's the kind of story that isn't thrilling in the usual sense. There are no explosions, no battles, no dramatic heroics, but it is persistently, quietly unsettling, and that makes it perfect for tonight. Let's begin at the very beginning, which is always a good place to start if you're looking to fully drift into a story that lulls you rather than shocks you awake. It's August of 1942. The war in the Pacific is raging. America has entered the conflict after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the West Coast is alive with air raid drills, civil defense patrols, and the low hum of military operations. Everyone is on alert. Ships sail along the coast, planes scan the skies, and in the gentle, lingering morning haze over San Francisco Bay, a slow, massive shadow appears. This shadow is L-8, a K-class blimp. Not particularly fast, not particularly elegant, but enormous in scale. Imagine a balloon stretched over 2 city blocks, with an aluminum skeleton and a gondola dangling beneath. It is slow, it is quiet, it is, for all intents and purposes, entirely harmless. And yet, when the men in San Francisco looked up that morning, some felt an inexplicable sense of pause. Perhaps it was just the size. Perhaps it was the idea that war had made all sorts of ordinary things seem uncanny. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the universe had a small, quiet sense of humor. The two men assigned to L-8 were Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Adams. Both were young, competent, and by all reports ordinary in temperament. Cody had joined the Navy to serve his country, but he also enjoyed the quieter pleasures of life, like sketching the occasional doodle in his notebook or humming softly to himself during long patrols. Adams, slightly younger, was the sort of man who liked lists, checklists, flight logs, meal plans, anything to impose order on the otherwise uncertain world of airship patrols. On the morning of August 16, 1942, they prepared L-8 for a routine anti-submarine patrol. Standard mission. Over the past year, Japanese submarines had been spotted near the Californian coast, though mostly they were scarce. Still, Navy protocol was strict. Patrol the designated sectors, scan the horizon, report anything unusual, and return home by nightfall. No one expected anything out of the ordinary that day. The weather was mild, a thin layer of fog hugging the coastline, waves rolling gently beneath the golden sun. L-8 arose, majestic and slow, over the sleepy morning streets. Now, blimps are inherently boring, if we're honest. They drift, they hover, they meander. Unlike planes, they are not nimble, they are not particularly fast, and they are not exciting to watch. But this is part of their charm. Watching a blimp is like watching the ocean itself, gradual, consistent, with only the occasional ripple of surprise. Cody and Adams ascended, checked their instruments, and continued a routine patrol along the Californian coast. They radioed in as per standard procedure, noting their location, weather conditions, and horizon visibility. All was normal, except that somewhere over the Pacific, or perhaps closer to shore than anyone realized, something happened. It is impossible to say exactly what, because neither Cody nor Adams returned to report it. There is speculation, of course, but we'll float through those gently in a moment. For now, let's consider the blimp itself, its slow, heavy drift, its gondola creaking softly as it bobbed along the fog. The blimp was alive in its own way, responding to the air currents, nudged by the wind, undisturbed by the absence of the men who should have been piloting it. Here's where the story becomes peculiar, not in a spectacular way, but in the way that quietly lingers in the back of your mind. Around 11:30 in the morning, a resident of Daly City reported seeing L8 descending toward the streets, drifting closer and closer to the residential area. At first, neighbors assumed it was normal landing. Blimps do land. Blimps do float gently down to mooring masts or open fields. But when L8 finally touched down on a quiet street, perfectly intact, something was unmistakably wrong. The gondola doors were open. The engine was humming as if ready to obey commands, and yet no one was inside. Neighbors were understandably confused. The Navy was called. Investigators arrived, peering into the empty seats, noting the flight logs, examining the instruments. Everything was as it should have been. The blimp had not crashed. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing had been tampered with. And yet, the men were gone. From this point on, the story slows into a series of gentle, meticulous observations. Navy officers interviewed neighbors. They examined L8 for mechanical faults. They reviewed prior patrol reports. And slowly, with all the monotony and careful attention of a librarian cataloging centuries-old scrolls, they concluded that there was no rational explanation. Some proposed foul play, sabotage, espionage, a daring abduction, but there was no evidence to support it. Others suggested that the men had fallen overboard into the foggy ocean, and somehow the blimp had continued its path, guided by a mechanical autopilot. This too seemed unlikely, though not impossible. The truth, of course, was probably somewhere between ordinary accident and inexplicable mystery. One peculiar detail remained: the flight log. It was found in perfect order, with check marks against every standard procedure. The handwriting was neat. No panic, no distress, no hint of what might have happened. It was as though Cody and Adams had simply evaporated, leaving behind their orderly, dutiful notes and a very confused Navy. Over the years, explanations have drifted in and out like the blimp itself over the foggy coastline. Some say Japanese submarines or spies intervened. Some say the men became disoriented, fell into the gondola during routine operations, and were carried out to sea. Others suggest something more whimsical, that the blimp, tired of human interference, simply nudged them away and continued its patrol. None of these theories are particularly satisfying, and perhaps that's the point. The ghost blimp is not a story of triumph or horror. It is a story of emptiness, of absence, of quiet, and the strange, lingering feeling that sometimes things happen in the world that cannot be neatly catalogued or explained. It floats in history like a whisper, a gentle riddle that lulls you into a calm curiosity. After the initial discovery of L8 on that quiet August morning, the Navy quickly moved to secure the area. Streets were cordoned off, Curious neighbors were politely asked to step back, and officers began cataloging everything. Every cord, every switch, every rope and fuel gauge was examined. The blimp had landed neatly across a residential street in Daly City without damaging any houses, cars, or power lines. It was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect landing, which is what made the absence of its pilots all the more perplexing. Normally, if a blimp lands somewhere unexpectedly, there would be a flurry of shouting, scrambling, and someone pointing fingers. Here, there was nothing, just the gentle hum of the engines and an empty gondola swaying slightly in the morning breeze. By noon, Navy investigators had begun documenting the scene in meticulous detail. Every inch of the gondola was photographed, every logbook page was copied. Officers noted that there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. The radio had been left on, perfectly tuned to standard patrol frequencies, and all instruments indicated that L8 had been functioning normally up to the point of landing. One of the most oddly reassuring or unsettling details, depending on your perspective, was the flight log itself. Cody and Adams had been disciplined men. Their entries were neat, careful, and followed Navy protocol to the letter. 0800, takeoff. 0830, patrol sector A, weather clear, visibility 8 miles. 0915, patrol sector B, nothing unusual. 01000, turning for home. And that was it. No cryptic scribbles, no hints of panic, no sudden bursts of distress, just perfectly ordinary, obedient notes from two men who apparently vanished without warning. This flight log became the centerpiece of speculation for decades. Some historians focus on its absurd neatness as evidence that something highly unusual had occurred. Others consider it a trivial detail. After all, perhaps the men simply stepped out and were lost to the fog. And yet, when you consider the context, the absence of human traces in an otherwise meticulously documented flight is what makes the story linger. The residents of Daly City had their own slow, lingering reactions. Many were more confused than alarmed. A blimp had never landed in their street before, and while the U.S. Navy had been around for years, a floating ghost ship was a new phenomenon. Mrs. Langley, who lived 2 blocks from the landing site, reported that she had seen the blimp descending slowly, like a cloud that had decided to rest on asphalt. "It was so big," she said, "and yet it didn't make a sound, and there was no one inside. I thought maybe the pilots had just gone for a walk or something." Her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, agreed, adding that the sight was both interesting and slightly unnerving, though not in a scary way. This is an important note. The story is oddly calm. There is tension in absence, in missing persons, but no chaos. The ghostliness is gentle, a quiet mystery that floats over the mundane backdrop of suburban life. The Navy, of course, could not leave a ghostly blimp unexamined. Teams were dispatched to assess whether a mechanical failure could have caused the pilots to disappear. One suggestion was that the gondola might have opened unexpectedly, causing the men to fall out. This theory is easy to dismiss upon inspection. Blimps do not drift perfectly to a landing site when their gondola doors are open mid-flight. In addition, the L8 had been flying slowly, steadily, and without turbulence. An accidental exit would have likely resulted in the blimp veering off course or crashing into something, a detail we know did not happen. Another theory entertained the idea of enemy intervention. Japanese submarines had been active along the Pacific coast, though mostly sporadically. Perhaps the men were taken, or perhaps they were lured away. There was no evidence of such interference, but it is worth noting that wartime paranoia made even the mildest events seem suspect. Then there was the suggestion of a psychological incident. Perhaps Cody and Adams became disoriented, or perhaps one convinced the other to leap into the foggy unknown. Again, the lack of signs of struggle, the absence of radio messages, and the neat flight log undermine this explanation. Once the initial investigation concluded, the Navy took the unusual step of towing L-8 back to its hangar. Here, the blimp sat quietly, like an empty museum exhibit, while officers cataloged every minor detail. Engines were inspected, the envelope, the massive fabric body of the blimp, was examined for punctures or tears. The gondola, which had cradled its vanished occupants, was checked repeatedly. Nothing at all explained the disappearance. And yet the blimp itself had returned, intact, obedient, like a very large, very calm animal that had decided to wander home. Over the weeks that followed, L-8 became something of a local legend. Navy personnel would speak of it in hushed, slow tones, as if recounting the tale of a particularly polite ghost. Residents in Daly City would occasionally glance at the sky, half expecting to see it drift past again. And in all of this, the story retained a gentle, unsettling charm, a mystery that was neither thrilling nor horrifying, but persistent in its quiet oddness. Decades later, historians, writers, and conspiracy enthusiasts have revisited the story. Documentaries are made, articles are published. The blimp's journey has been reconstructed using weather data, Navy records, and anecdotal accounts. Yet the essential mystery remains. L-8 returned alone. 2 men vanished. No one can say exactly why. Some of the more fanciful theories propose extraterrestrial involvement or temporal anomalies. Others are perfectly mundane, a combination of navigational error, fog, and miscommunication. Either way, the story drifts gently in that peculiar space between normal history and inexplicable occurrence. And that is why it continues to fascinate sleepy historians, conspiracy buffs, and casual listeners alike. As we let this story settle in, imagine the fog rolling over the California coast in 1942. Picture L-8 gliding silently above the waves, an enormous, gentle machine, empty but perfectly intact, a ghostly echo of wartime diligence. There are no villains here, no climactic battles, no fireworks. Just the calm, consistent, slightly strange drift of a blimp and the unanswered questions it leaves behind. We can almost hear the faint creak of its gondola as it lands perfectly on an empty street, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the quiet, unremarkable absurdity of the ghost blimp is its own story, one that does not need resolution because the mystery itself is already soothingly complete. Once L-8 had been secured, the Navy faced a quiet dilemma: how to explain what had occurred. Their first instinct, naturally, was to re-examine the flight and the circumstances surrounding it, because that is what you do when 2 men vanish into thin air while leaving behind a perfectly functioning airship. Investigators reviewed patrol logs from other K-class blimps in the area. They examined weather reports, wind currents, and potential mechanical anomalies. They conducted interviews with personnel who had flown alongside Cody and Adams. Slowly, in a series of calm, methodical steps, they built a picture of the events leading up to the landing. It was, as it turned out, an unusually uneventful flight. The blimp had taken off at approximately 8 a.m., passed through a light layer of fog along the coast, and maintained a steady course. Radio communications were normal, as were instrument readings. There were no reported sightings of enemy activity in the patrol area. There were no mechanical failures. And yet the pilots had disappeared. The Navy attempted a full reconstruction of the flight path. Using drift calculations and engine performance data, they mapped the trajectory of L-8. By the end of this process, they confirmed one simple fact. The blimp had behaved entirely as it should. It had not veered off course, it had not crashed. It had landed almost precisely where the pilots would have intended. And yet, the absence of Cody and Adams remained the most puzzling feature. Theories emerged, most of them quietly speculative and a bit pedestrian. Perhaps a sudden gust of wind had caused the pilots to lose their balance and exit the gondola. Perhaps they were overcome by some brief, inexplicable medical incident. Perhaps they were abducted. All of these were in some sense unsatisfying explanations, though the Navy dutifully cataloged each. They did not make much of a fuss publicly. After all, it is easier to report that a blimp returned safely than to report that two men vanished in broad daylight. And so the story began to drift into legend. The residents of Daly City, meanwhile, had more immediate observations. People who lived along the street where L-8 had landed described a scene of gentle surrealism. The blimp, enormous and slow-moving, had descended like a cloud that had forgotten it was supposed to be somewhere else. No engines sputtered, no alarms rang, just a massive, quiet airship, empty and yet perfectly functional. Children in the neighborhood, unsurprisingly, were fascinated. Adults were polite but cautious. Some called friends to recount the oddity. Newspapers, always alert to peculiar stories during wartime, briefly noted the incident, though they refrained from dramatic phrasing. "Navy blimp lands empty on local street," read one headline. It was accurate, calm, and entirely devoid of sensationalism. The story slowly entered local folklore. People would glance at the sky for years afterward, half expecting L-8 to drift by again. Some joked that the blimp had simply decided that humans were too boring for its company and had sent the pilots away. Others whispered that it was a ghost. Neither explanation is particularly verifiable, but both fit the sleepy, understated tone of the event itself. In the weeks following the incident, the Navy attempted to send other K-class blimps along similar patrol routes. They hoped to determine whether there might have been mechanical issues specific to L-8, or if some anomaly of weather or air currents had caused the pilots to disappear. All subsequent patrols returned with their crews intact. Nothing unusual occurred. This only deepened the quiet perplexity surrounding L-8. The blimp itself remained at its hangar, examined and re-examined. Investigators found every component to be in perfect working order. No unusual wear, no signs of tampering, no defects that might explain the disappearance of the pilots. Some engineers proposed that a combination of calm winds and a peculiar flight pattern could have caused the gondola doors to open gently, allowing the men to be swept out. Others noted that L-8 had a history of minor mechanical quirks, none of which were dangerous. Still, no explanation satisfactorily accounted for the empty gondola. The story, when it reached newspapers and military bulletins, was treated with gentle curiosity rather than alarm. There were no headlines proclaiming alien abductions or supernatural interference. The tone was calm, factual, and slightly bemused. A blimp landed without pilots. This calm reporting contributed to the slow mythos of L-8. Historians later noted that the story's power derives not from violence, not from action, but the peculiar interplay of normality and absence. Here is a massive, obedient machine, designed to patrol, designed to carry humans, arriving exactly where it should, and yet empty. Radio programs occasionally mentioned it. Wartime newsletters published small sketches of the blimp hovering over the street. Over time, it became less of a news story and more of a gentle oddity, a quiet riddle in the otherwise mundane landscape of wartime California. Modern investigations and theories. Decades later, researchers, conspiracy writers, and aviation enthusiasts have examined the case in detail. There are a few main schools of thought. Accidental fall or disorientation. Some suggest the pilots may have lost balance in the gondola and fallen out during flight. This is plausible but awkward as the blimp's trajectory and landing seem too precise for a mid-air accident. Enemy intervention, another theory, posits that Japanese submarines, aircraft, or spies somehow took the pilots. Again, there is no evidence, and patrol logs indicate that the area was quiet that morning. Some suggest that L-8 may have continued on autopilot, or that the blimp's buoyancy and slow drift allowed it to land without active guidance. This is intriguing and somewhat plausible, though it does not explain the complete absence of the pilots. Paranormal or whimsical explanations, less academically rigorous but popular among casual enthusiasts. The blimp is a ghost. The pilots were taken by forces unknown. The airship itself is sentient and politely removed them. These theories are, naturally, speculative and never presented as fact. All of these linger quietly, like the blimp itself, floating just out of reach of certainty. And that is part of the appeal. The gentle, unexplained nature of L-8's voyage allows the story to drift in memory, like fog over the Pacific. Though small, the story has persisted in aviation circles, in local lore, and in lists of unexplained wartime mysteries. Writers and historians revisit it, often with the same calm, slow delivery that Cody and Adams themselves might have appreciated on a long, uneventful patrol. Books about unusual military events mention it. Online articles describe it. Podcasts recount it in hushed tones. And always, in every retelling, the story's charm is subtle, understated, and slightly snarky. Two men vanish, the blimp lands neatly, and the Navy shrugs. It is a story of absence, of calm mystery, and of slow, gentle bewilderment. Unlike tales of heroics or epic battles, it is not memorable because of danger. It is memorable because of its polite absurdity. And of course, after all investigations, reports, and theories, the question remains, what actually happened? Cody and Adams were never found. The blimp, intact, silently drifted back to land. The logs offer no hint. The residents remember only the strange, enormous shadow gliding down onto their street. There is no definitive answer. Perhaps there never will be. And in that, there is something quietly satisfying. A large, obedient blimp, a vanished crew, and a quiet riddle that persists decades later, drifting in memory, never demanding an answer, perfectly content in its gentle absurdity. You know the feeling when summer is supposed to be bright, warm, and lazy, and yet somehow the universe decides to be a little inconvenient. Well, 1816 was a year that specialized in that sort of gentle cruelty. People called it the year without a summer, though calling it a summer at all might have been a stretch, unless you count snow and frost in July as seasonal highlights. So dim the lights, settle into a cozy chair, and let's float back to the early 19th century. Picture Europe and the Americas, two regions accustomed to their seasonal rhythms, suddenly thrown off by something far beyond the reach of kings and governments. In Indonesia, on a remote volcanic island called Mount Tambora, a volcano decided to have a dramatic tantrum. And by tantrum, I mean it exploded with a force so massive that it affected the entire planet. Now, volcanic eruptions happen, of course. The Earth has been doing this since it figured out molten rock was a fun thing to play with. But Tambora was exceptional. It ejected enormous amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a veil of particles that circled the globe. Think of it as a slow-moving, planet-wide cloud filter, dimming the sun and cooling temperatures across continents. It's subtle, almost invisible to the eye at first, until you notice that it's too cold for crops in June, or that frost has claimed your early harvest. By the time the ash cloud drifted to New England, the usual warmth of July was replaced with snow. Snow in July. And not just a few scattered flurries, but persistent damaging frost that killed fruit trees, vegetables, and, well, optimism. Farmers scratched their heads, children shivered in thin cotton clothing, and city dwellers watched their market baskets slowly empty as food became scarce. Europe, of course, wasn't spared. The Alpine regions saw failed harvests, and famine quietly crept into villages and cities alike. Now, here's a detail that makes the story particularly human. When we talk about famine and snow in summer, we tend to imagine grand statistics and dry historical accounts. But imagine the small personal tragedies. Families eating bark or roots, neighbors sharing what little grain they had, and parents gently trying to explain to children why ice crystals are falling from the sky in July. The cold didn't just bite, it whispered, slowly, at the edges of every household, sowing discomfort, worry, and the occasional resigned sigh. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, a group of young writers was wandering near Lake Geneva, doing what writers tend to do, brooding, complaining about the weather, and generally feeling existential. One of them was Mary Shelley, just 18 at the time, although she probably felt much older due to the relentless gloom. Alongside her were Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, two men whose moods were as stormy as the skies above them. Stuck indoors by endless rain and cold, they amused themselves by telling ghost stories, a pastime that, at the time, might have seemed like a mild distraction. But one story in particular, inspired by the persistent gloomy atmosphere, would evolve into something iconic: Frankenstein. Yes, a catastrophic volcanic eruption in a faraway land indirectly inspired one of the most famous horror novels ever written. There's something poetic about that, isn't it? A natural disaster becomes a literary disaster in the imagination, quietly connecting the deathly chill of New England frost to the electric horror of a young woman's pen. And all of this happened without anyone shouting or forcing the issue. The world just shifted, slowly, inexorably, lethargically. Perfect for bedtime listening. So let's meander through some of the details of this year, gently, without rushing, almost as if we're floating down a slow river. In Europe, harvests were so bad that bread prices soared. Imagine walking down cobbled streets, the smell of cold, damp soil everywhere, and bakers shaking their heads, weighing flour as if it were gold. And then consider the irony. This year of cold, snow, and famine comes just a few years after the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe was already economically fragile. Governments and monarchs, exhausted from decades of conflict, could offer little solace beyond empty platitudes and perhaps some mild administrative efficiency. Meanwhile, the rural poor, those who relied on subsistence farming, were forced to adapt. Some dug up roots that had been meant only for animal feed. Others tried to trade goods they didn't have, walking long distances just to find a loaf of bread or a handful of potatoes. Snow in July might sound like a whimsical story now, but for those living through it, it was quiet, relentless misery. And yet, life continued. People wore extra layers, worked longer hours, and occasionally grumbled to the heavens about the unfairness of climate. In New England, the story is a little different, but just as slow-moving. Farmers, noticing frost on strawberry plants in June, were initially baffled. July came, and with it, snow. August arrived, and temperatures still hovered unnervingly low. Livestock struggled, hay crops failed. Families had to ration what little food they had stored from previous seasons. Children who might have spent the summer outdoors found themselves confined indoors, listening to parents discuss droughts in Europe and frost in their own backyards. In a way, the entire Atlantic world felt smaller, closer, as the effects of a distant volcano reminded everyone that geography can't always protect you from disaster. And it wasn't just crops and snow. The cold, damp weather contributed to outbreaks of disease. People weakened by hunger or poor nutrition were more susceptible to illnesses that might have been minor under normal circumstances. So while the world looked like a bizarre postcard with snow in July, underneath that stillness, life continued in quiet struggle. Every cough, every thin meal, every shiver in the night added to the slow rhythm of 1816. Back in Europe, the weather affected more than just agriculture. Cultural events were postponed or canceled. Travel was difficult. Roads turned to mud. The aristocracy, often insulated from the harsh realities of famine, nonetheless found their lives subtly disrupted. Balls and social gatherings meant to be highlights of the summer season were dampened, literally by rain and fog, and figuratively by the knowledge that crops were failing elsewhere. Even the rich, who could afford to ignore hunger, couldn't entirely ignore the weather. And here's a fun, dry observation. It was also called the poverty year in Switzerland and parts of France. Not because anyone was suddenly reckless with money, but because money simply couldn't buy you warmth or food when the world itself was out of joint. You could have all the coins in your purse, all the silk in your wardrobe, and still watch frost bite at your cabbage patch. Monetarily useless, but historically fascinating. Meanwhile, writers, poets, and artists were quietly observing. Lord Byron, famously dramatic even in ordinary weather, apparently spent much of the summer complaining about the cold, pacing around Lake Geneva like a man possessed by mild annoyance. Percy Shelley, of course, found poetic inspiration in the gloom. And Mary Shelley, nudged by a combination of boredom, cold, and general existential anxiety, produced the concept of a monster stitched together from dead bodies. Again, subtle, slow causation. Natural disaster nudges human imagination, and we end up with Frankenstein. And if you think about it, the connection between climate and culture here is almost hypnotic. A volcano puffing ash thousands of miles away, indirectly causing snow in July in New England, famine in Europe, and a classic horror novel in Switzerland. It's like history is slowly flipping pages in a book you can't put down, except each page takes months to turn. There's no dramatic crescendo, there's no thunderclap, just the gentle, inexorable movement of a world slightly out of rhythm. By the end of 1816, the year without a summer, people had adapted in small, mundane ways. They planted fast-growing crops where possible. They ate things they never thought edible. They traded what little they had and waited patiently for the sun to return to its usual place in the sky. Meanwhile, authors and thinkers documented, narrated, and philosophized, some perhaps in a sleepy tone, others with more dramatic urgency. So, if you're still with me, wrapped in blankets or sipping your tea, just remember, this wasn't a story of heroism or daring. It was a story of patience, quiet adaptation, and the slow, creeping influence of forces far beyond human control. And also, slightly, the story of how boredom, rain, and cold can sometimes produce something remarkable. A story that echoes through time, a cultural artifact born from discomfort. Let's float for a moment over the larger impacts, still gentle and slow. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. Europe experienced food shortages, and prices for basic staples soared. The poor, already struggling, were forced to improvise. In North America, the small farmers of New England faced months of frost and failed crops. Travel and communication were disrupted. Even those with wealth and privilege found their routines disrupted, if only mildly. And yet, life continued. People adapted. They complained softly to neighbors. They rationed food carefully. They watched the clouds, noted the cold, and waited. The world kept turning, slowly, rhythmically, inexorably. And somewhere, in a small house near Lake Geneva, a young woman imagined a monster in the dim, cold light, stitching together ideas as she had watched the world stitch together its own survival strategies. As the cold persisted through the months, people began to notice patterns, subtle but persistent. In Europe, the Alps and northern regions saw repeated frosts that damaged vineyards and cereal crops. Wine production suffered. Bread prices fluctuated dramatically. Bakers and millers, who normally worked with predictable schedules, found themselves improvising. They ground whatever grains were available, sometimes mixing barley with oats, rye with bits of cornmeal, anything that could produce something vaguely bread-like. And yet, despite their efforts, shortages persisted. In Switzerland, the small villages near Lake Geneva found themselves relying heavily on stored grains. The wealthy could afford to buy imported wheat, but transportation was complicated by muddy roads, swollen rivers, and lingering ice in higher altitudes. Rural communities resorted to eating roots and dried leaves, sometimes even bark, which they roasted to make them palatable. Children, thinly clothed, learned early that summer could feel like winter. Every morning, families would check their gardens and fields, hoping that frost hadn't destroyed the few shoots they had planted, only to find the cold had won again. The story wasn't much better in Germany or France. In Germany, frost damaged potato fields that had been planted as a safety net against poor grain yields. People who relied on potatoes for survival had to look elsewhere, often turning to legumes or barley, which were less satisfying and nutritionally inferior. In France, the previous decades of political upheaval, revolution, Napoleonic wars, had already strained the economy. The year without a summer added a quiet, creeping pressure to an already fragile system. Social unrest wasn't immediate or explosive, but quietly, households were stretched thin. Across the Atlantic, New England farmers were quietly flabbergasted. Imagine July, usually warm enough to encourage outdoor work, suddenly blanketed in snow or frost. Fruit trees suffered. Cornfields were stunted. Garden vegetables shriveled before reaching maturity. Livestock, too, felt the unusual chill, and farmers had to improvise feeding strategies. Grain that would normally go to animals was diverted to feed families. The rhythm of daily life slowed as people adapted to the chill, moving from task to task with resigned patience rather than any urgent energy. And yet, the human capacity to adapt quietly without fanfare is remarkable. People planted fast-growing crops like turnips and cabbage, harvested early wherever possible, and rationed food with meticulous care. Markets functioned more slowly, trading food in smaller quantities. Communities leaned on one another for support, sharing grain, root vegetables, and whatever else they could spare. It was a slow, collective resilience, almost imperceptible in its quiet endurance. Meanwhile, in England, newspapers reported frost in unusual months, failed harvests, and rising prices. Merchants and government officials debated what could be done, mostly concluding that not much could be done. Food shipments were delayed or lost, roads were muddy, and the sun itself seemed to cooperate with no one. The discussion was mostly polite, resigned, and slightly perfunctory, because what else could they do but wait? Even the natural world seemed to be affected in ways more subtle than human discomfort. Birds migrated late, or in smaller numbers. Insects, whose life cycles depended on warmth, were delayed, affecting pollination and further complicating crop yields. It was a cascading series of mild inconveniences, each imperceptible on its own, but together forming a quiet, persistent pressure on the ecosystem. Back in Switzerland, the artistic circle at Lake Geneva continued to observe and absorb the gloomy environment. Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron wrote, talked, and wandered the lakeside paths whenever the weather allowed. The persistent gray skies and intermittent rain became a backdrop for quiet reflection, philosophical musings, and the occasional storytelling challenge. As noted, the challenge of creating ghost stories during long, gloomy evenings gave birth to the concept of Frankenstein. But the story was only one of many creative efforts during that slow, damp summer. Interestingly, other cultural effects emerged more quietly. Across Europe, newspapers and pamphlets documented frost, crop failures, and unusual weather patterns. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats wrote letters noting the strange summer. These letters, often overlooked, provide historians centuries later with the subtle evidence of a world disrupted not by war or politics, but by climate. The correspondence is measured, understated, and sometimes humorous in its dry resignation. People noting frost in July with the same tone they might use to complain about rain in London. In France, some historians point to minor riots and food protests during 1816, but these were sporadic and localized rather than widespread. Villagers and townspeople protested bread shortages, but there was no dramatic, sweeping revolution prompted directly by the cold. It's as if the chill induced a kind of weary patience, a slow-moving endurance that muted anger without erasing concern. People learned to wait. Patience became a survival strategy. Meanwhile, in New England, families faced the slow erosion of their food stores. Farmers wrote in diaries recording frost in July, snow in June, and the curious resilience of certain crops. Communities shared resources quietly, traded grain in small quantities, and did their best to protect livestock. Children grew up learning that summer was not guaranteed. Adults learned to ration, improvise, and endure. And perhaps most importantly, writers began to document it, turning observation into record and record into story. And so life continued, slowly, quietly. The world turned. The sun shone occasionally through the ash-filtered skies, and people adapted. In subtle ways, the volcanic eruption of Tambora and its global consequences became embedded in daily routines, letters, diaries, and eventually literature. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, of course, the most famous literary product of this particular environmental catastrophe, but other works emerged more quietly. Journals, letters, and minor novels recorded human endurance, the strangeness of frost in summer, and the peculiar interactions between humans and climate. Artists painted the gray landscapes of a cold, wet summer. Farmers wrote in their diaries, noting the failures of crops, the odd timing of harvests, and the peculiar persistence of frost. Scientists observed patterns, recorded temperatures, and speculated about causes. The year without a summer, then, is a study of subtlety, not in dramatic explosions, nor in loud revolutions, but in the quiet persistence of unusual climate and the slow human response. People did not die in spectacular numbers, though some did succumb to famine and disease. They did not revolt dramatically. They adapted, they recorded, they observed. They told stories that would eventually inspire literature, science, and cultural memory. Even geographically distant regions experienced ripples. China, India, and other parts of Asia saw minor climatic anomalies, though records are less comprehensive. North America, New England in particular, felt frost and snow during months normally dedicated to planting and harvesting. Europe experienced crop failures, minor unrest, and a muted cultural response. And all of this happened without anyone in power being able to directly intervene. The world, in other words, was quietly but thoroughly humbled by forces beyond human control. By the time the year drew to a close, the effects of the volcanic eruption were evident everywhere, yet subtle. Life continued. Crops eventually grew in the following year. Children survived, often slightly malnourished but alive. Letters and diaries documented frost, famine, and literary inspiration. People adjusted, just as they had always done when faced with minor natural disasters, inconvenient weather, or quiet human suffering. In hindsight, the year without a summer seems almost quaint, a curious historical anecdote. But for those living through it, it was slow, relentless, and unavoidable. A distant volcano reshaped climate, disrupted agriculture, influenced literature, and quietly reminded humanity of its vulnerability. It's a story without dramatic flair, explosive events, or heroic interventions. It is instead a story of endurance, quiet adaptation, and the understated influence of natural forces. And so, as we let our minds drift back to the present, perhaps wrapped in blankets or leaning in a chair, we can reflect on the gentle, pervasive power of the year without a summer. A volcano, ash in the stratosphere, frost in July, and the faint, lingering echo of Mary Shelley's pen, all reminders that history sometimes moves slowly, quietly, and almost imperceptibly, while leaving profound traces in culture, society, and the imagination. The oddest chapters of Cold War history. A story that combines capitalism, desperation, soda, and warships. Because, apparently, those things sometimes mix. This tale begins in the late 1980s, during the final fizzing moments of the Soviet Union. The year was 1989, and the world looked very different. The Berlin Wall was still standing, although slightly tired and looking like it needed a touch-up. Reagan was out of office, Bush Sr. was in, and everyone was still confused about whether the Cold War would end with fireworks or quietly like a leaky tap. Meanwhile, in the world of consumer goods, PepsiCo was quietly plotting something that most people thought impossible, acquiring a fleet of warships in exchange for soda. Yes, soda. The sweet, carbonated, sugary kind. Now, to understand why this is even remotely possible, we have to first understand the Soviet Union's relationship with Pepsi. The Soviets loved Pepsi. They loved it in a very specific, intense, almost obsessive way. It wasn't just a drink. No. Pepsi was a symbol. A symbol that said, we too can taste Western capitalism, at least in a bubbly, slightly overcarbonated bottle. It was also a way to impress visiting dignitaries, because nothing says international diplomacy than a chilled can of cola being offered politely by a bureaucrat in a gray suit with shoulder pads that could double as a shelf for light groceries. But here's the catch. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union had a bit of a cash flow problem, which is one way of saying they didn't really have much cold hard cash lying around. Trading rubles for Pepsi was tricky. The ruble wasn't exactly the global equivalent of gold. Outside the Iron Curtain, it was more like a colorful paper that children sometimes drew on, though adults still insisted it was valuable. So how do you pay for a beloved commodity if you can't exactly hand over stacks of usable currency? Well, the Soviets did what anyone facing a capitalist problem would do. They offered something that might seem absurd in the Western world: a fleet of naval vessels. In 1989, negotiations between PepsiCo and the Soviet government reached an apex. This was not a casual meeting in a boardroom with people sipping lattes and doodling on legal pads. No, this was a carefully orchestrated dance of strategy and bureaucracy. The Soviets, in their infinite practicality, decided that instead of giving cash, they would give Pepsi something else of comparable value. That something else happened to be a collection of decommissioned warships. Not just a few, a fleet, including submarines, destroyers, and frigates. To put this in perspective, for a brief, sparkling moment, PepsiCo could claim it had the sixth largest navy in the world. Now, imagine the internal conversations at Pepsi headquarters. I can almost hear someone slowly pushing back their swivel chair, looking over the top of their glasses and saying, "So you're telling me we just bought submarines for soda?" And the reply, probably delivered with the sort of deadpan charm that could convince anyone. "Exactly. But let's not get too excited. We'll probably just sell them." Selling them, as it turns out, was exactly what happened. PepsiCo wasn't suddenly preparing to go to war or patrol the Atlantic with a fleet of Soviet relics. No, they acted like the reasonable capitalist company they were. They auctioned off the ships to a Swedish firm. The firm dismantled them and likely turned them into scrap metal, which, if you think about it, is a fitting end. The Soviets gave PepsiCo ships, PepsiCo sold ships, and the world got, well, more aluminum and steel than anyone had probably needed. But let's drift a bit back to the initial spark of the story. How did Pepsi even get in the Soviet Union in the first place? The company was actually the first American soft drink to break the Iron Curtain, which was no small feat. Negotiations began in the 1950s and 60s with a famous deal in 1972 that involved a barter arrangement. At the time, Pepsi exchanged syrup for vodka. That's right, cola for vodka. It was a kind of socialist remix of the classic capitalist lemonade stand, and it worked. Because why not trade a sugary drink for a strong alcoholic spirit and call it a business success? By the late 1980s, the barter system was well established, though the stakes had escalated. Pepsi had grown used to getting creative with deals, but the 1989 deal was still remarkable. The fleet was no small gesture. It included submarines, missile cruisers, and other assorted naval assets that, if you squint, could be mistaken for a full-fledged armada. Pepsi, of course, wasn't about to man these ships with marketing interns and delivery drivers. No, the company liquidated the fleet, made a tidy profit, and returned to its main line of business, selling soda to a world increasingly addicted to fizz. Of course, while we're floating gently through this tale, we should note the peculiar irony. For a moment in the late 1980s, a beverage company had more naval power than most countries. The sixth largest navy wasn't France, wasn't Italy, it was PepsiCo. The implications are, shall we say, mildly absurd. But then again, history is full of such absurdities. The world isn't always logical, and commerce, as we see here, can be stranger than war itself. Let's drift slightly to consider the individuals involved, because no story is complete without the humans quietly sipping from their cups of fate. On the Soviet side, you had leaders who were probably tired of their own bureaucracy, looking for practical ways to keep up appearances. On PepsiCo's side, executives were quietly thrilled. Not thrilled enough to write an ironic memo that would end up in a museum, but thrilled enough to think, yes, we own submarines now. Let's quietly sell them and move on with our lives. It's important to note that this story, while comically strange, also highlights the absurd lengths to which international trade and negotiation can stretch. Here is a capitalist company floating in an era defined by socialist scarcity, trading sugary beverages for military hardware. The transactional details might boggle the mind, but in the sleepy, oddly logical rhythm of history, it makes a peculiar kind of sense. Pepsi's secret navy wasn't just a footnote in business history. It's a gentle reminder that commerce can be whimsical, that desperation can take creative forms, and that sometimes the world's largest fleets don't need sailors, just accountants and a faint love for fizz. And while we drift to the edge of this narrative, let's pause to imagine it. Corporate meetings discussing submarines, bureaucrats signing paperwork for cola, and somewhere in between, the quiet realization that life, history, and soda are all just carbonated in their own ways. By the late 1980s, the deal had been struck, and PepsiCo was officially in possession of a flotilla that, for a brief moment, dwarfed many traditional navies. These were no paper ships, mind you. Submarines, missile cruisers, and destroyers, icons of Cold War military ambition, now found themselves in the hands of a soft drink company. The ships were still painted in their standard naval grays, still had their complex mechanical systems intact, and yet their fate would be far from military glory. PepsiCo executives quickly realized the practical limitations of this newfound power. Operating a fleet requires sailors, navigational expertise, and crucially, a purpose. The purpose of selling soda had not changed, and despite the fleet's impressive size, there was no strategic need to patrol the Atlantic or intimidate competitors. Instead, the company did what any sensible business would do. They liquidated the assets. The submarines and warships were sold to a Swedish firm that specialized in dismantling old naval equipment, turning them into scrap metal. And just like that, a temporary soda for submarines arrangement concluded, leaving only the absurd memory of a cola empire that could have, in theory, challenged national navies. The broader economic context of the USSR adds a sleepy charm to this story. The USSR, facing economic stagnation and dwindling access to foreign currency, found itself needing consumer goods that could improve the lives of ordinary citizens, or at least make visiting diplomats feel that life behind the Iron Curtain wasn't completely bleak. Pepsi, in contrast, saw an opportunity to expand its market presence, knowing full well that the USSR's inability to pay in conventional cash required creativity. So, in a sense, this was not just a transaction, but a delicate dance of necessity, innovation, and mild absurdity. Looking back, the story is also a reflection of the surreal intersection between capitalism and socialism. Here was a Western corporation quietly maneuvering its way into a communist stronghold, acquiring military hardware in exchange for a sweet beverage, and then converting that hardware back into liquid assets. The narrative is calm, almost soothing in its rhythm, but layered with a gentle irony. The largest fleet in Pepsi's corporate history never fired a single shot, nor did it serve any purpose beyond temporary numerical dominance on a global scale. As we drift along, it's worth noting that the story doesn't really end with the sale of the fleet. Pepsi's brief naval supremacy became a curious anecdote, a peculiar intersection of business strategy and historical coincidence that has persisted in popular memory. Military historians occasionally chuckle at the idea, while corporate strategists marvel at the audacity. And the Soviets? They got their Pepsi, their fizzing Western indulgence, and a small lesson in the unpredictable ways global trade can manifest. In many ways, the story is a quiet meditation on human priorities and the peculiar value we assign to objects and commodities. Submarines and soda, warships and syrup, militaristic symbols and consumerist pleasures, all converging in a single, sleepy transaction. The fleet may have been sold for scrap, but the lesson lingers. History doesn't always march in straight lines, and sometimes the oddest episodes are the ones most worth remembering. And so, the saga of Pepsi's secret navy floats gently into memory. No dramatic battles, no heroic voyages, just the soft hum of business, the occasional hiss of carbonation, and the quiet absurdity of a world where soda temporarily ruled the waves. In the aftermath of the fleet sale, PepsiCo returned to its standard operations, selling soda and focusing on marketing campaigns that rarely involved submarines or missile cruisers. Yet, the story of the secret Navy quietly cemented itself in corporate folklore. Employees would occasionally joke about the naval division that had never existed on an organizational chart. Board meetings might include a sarcastic aside about which executive got to command the flagship, or who would have the honorary title of Admiral of Kola. It was a minor, amusing footnote, a reminder that corporate history sometimes drifts into whimsical territory. Meanwhile, in the broader context of global economics and diplomacy, the deal stood as a small example of barter systems surviving in modern times. While most international trade relied on currency, the Soviets and PepsiCo demonstrated that goods and services could still serve as viable exchange mediums. One could imagine Soviet officials walking down the corridors of government, discussing the value of submarines in terms of Pepsi cans, and silently wondering how they had come to this. It's the kind of scenario that doesn't provoke panic, but instead offers a gentle, surreal amusement. The story also invites reflection on how history treats absurdity. In textbooks, PepsiCo's secret navy may appear as a brief anecdote tucked away in a sidebar or a footnote, easily skipped over by the hurried reader. But in the slower, quieter narration of historical curiosity, it becomes a meditative journey, imagining fleets of warships traded for soda, envisioning corporate strategists calculating tonnage versus beverage volume, picturing Cold War bureaucrats nodding seriously at the idea of Pepsi submarines. These mental images, though whimsical, enrich our understanding of how human priorities and economic systems intersect in unexpected ways. And let's not forget the cultural resonance. PepsiCo's temporary control of warships may have had no strategic military impact, but it did leave a mark on storytelling, advertising lore, and even casual trivia. It is a reminder that history doesn't always follow logical patterns, and that the most mundane-seeming transactions can, under certain circumstances, create stories that linger for decades. People sharing trivia at parties or late-night enthusiasts scrolling through the odd corners of business history now have a narrative that combines humor, irony, and the comforting mundanity of corporate life. The secret navy is also a quiet testament to human creativity and negotiation. The Soviets, facing economic hardship, found an unconventional solution to a practical problem. PepsiCo, identifying a business opportunity, navigated an unusual international exchange with composure and a hint of deadpan humor. Both sides engaged in a slow, deliberate, almost sleepy dance of trade that resulted in a mutually beneficial outcome, albeit in a way that sounds almost absurd in retrospect. Ultimately, the story floats gently to its conclusion without fireworks or dramatics. No battles were fought, no flags were raised, and no history books required correction. Instead, it leaves us with a soft, ironic smile at the peculiarities of human decision-making. Sometimes, history is not about grand heroics or monumental shifts. It is about small, whimsical, and oddly satisfying transactions, like a fleet of submarines being traded for soda and then quietly sold for scrap. PepsiCo's secret navy may have existed only briefly in tangible form, but its story remains eternal in the quiet, contemplative spaces of historical curiosity, ready to be recounted in a slow, monotone voice while you sip your beverage and let the world float by in gentle, carbonated rhythm. The corridors of ancient China. Picture this. It's the year 1974. You're a farmer in Shanxi province, somewhere in the rolling fields not far from Xi'an, the ancient capital where dynasties once rose and fell like the tide. Life is mostly the same as it's always been. Sunrise, a bit of toil, some water, and maybe a few chickens. Very normal, very ordinary. Until, of course, you hit something unusual. This something would later become one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But right now, in the moment, it's just a lump of clay. Or so it seems. Our story begins slowly, like the gentle patter of rain over mud brick rooftops, meandering toward the clash of history, politics, and human curiosity. So, a group of local farmers, probably sweaty, dusty, maybe slightly irritated that the well they were digging was stubbornly refusing to cooperate, noticed something odd. The soil wasn't behaving like regular dirt. It had a strange density, like it was trying to tell them something. And then they struck it. Clay figures, life-sized, half-buried, looking back at them as if they'd been waiting there for over 2 millennia. It's not exactly every day that your shovel hits a nearly 2,000-year-old soldier staring blankly, ready for a war that ended long before anyone in the village was born. Now, you'd think this would be the moment of instant joy, right? Local fame, perhaps even a sense of divine intervention. But no. Because, of course, history rarely respects the neat expectations of modern humans. The Chinese government, already careful about controlling information and stories, quickly became aware of the discovery. And rather than rolling out the red carpet, there was hesitation, a curious, deliberate hush that would become a defining feature of this tale. You see, the Terracotta Army was, and still is, not just a bunch of clay soldiers. These figures were part of the elaborate tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He was a man obsessed with immortality, with grandiose visions, and with leaving behind monuments that would literally last forever. The army wasn't for actual battle, it was for the afterlife, a massive silent force meant to protect the emperor in his death. But in 1974, that didn't immediately matter to anyone. What mattered was who got to control this discovery and how. And so begins the first layer of the story we're going to gently meander through, the tension between local lives and global historical curiosity. The farmers had unearthed something extraordinary, yet instead of celebration, they were met with subtle intimidation, bureaucratic coldness, and promises that might have sounded reassuring at first, but slowly revealed themselves as thin, unsatisfying veneers of authority. The government was interested in the army, yes, but they were also interested in keeping it under wraps, studying it quietly, controlling the narrative, and ensuring that this monumental piece of history didn't become a source of inconvenient attention. Let's float over to the farmers themselves. They weren't scholars or archaeologists. They were ordinary people, accustomed to the rhythms of seasons, the stubbornness of soil, and the small, almost imperceptible negotiations that every day demanded. To them, digging a well was practical. Finding a soldier staring up at them was surreal. But their new reality came with responsibilities they hadn't asked for, protecting the site, following the instructions of officials who came to evaluate their discovery, and essentially fading into the background while experts and government representatives decided the future of what they had found. And here's a slightly melancholy, almost sleepy thought. While the world would eventually celebrate the Terracotta Army with museums, documentaries, and international exhibitions, the farmers themselves largely remained in relative obscurity. Some returned to their fields, some faced subtle reprisals for digging in forbidden areas, and many were never fairly compensated for the cultural treasure they literally unearthed with their own hands. History is often romanticized, but here it's a gentle reminder that the humans who touch it first don't always reap the benefits. Now, if you let yourself drift into this story, you'll notice a pattern that is quietly tragic, almost like a lullaby with minor key undertones. The intersection of human ambition, politics, and the slow, inevitable march of time. Qin Shi Huang, who ordered the army to be created, could never have imagined the political frameworks of a 20th century communist state. Yet his dreams and designs collided with them. The farmers, digging for water, could never have imagined that their lives would brush against the echo of imperial grandeur. And the government officials, meticulously cataloging every broken spear and fractured horse, were caught between curiosity, caution, and the desire for control. Let's gently explore what these soldiers themselves tell us, though they remain silent in clay. Each figure is uniquely sculpted, with individual features that suggest artisans spent hours, days, months trying to capture human distinctiveness. The generals, the archers, the infantrymen, they are not identical. Subtle differences in facial expression, posture, and attire indicate social hierarchies, rank, and even regional origins. Imagine standing before them, not in a museum, but on that dusty plain, watching rows of soldiers stretching beyond the horizon. It's as if time paused for a moment, allowing you a quiet glimpse into the mind of an emperor obsessed with order, security, and the afterlife. And yet, there's a quiet irony here. These soldiers were built for eternity, designed never to move, never to age, never to speak, and yet their discovery was treated as a temporary secret, a fragile whisper in the machinery of modern governance. The emperor wanted permanence, the farmers wanted water, the government wanted control, and history? History just quietly waits, like a cat perched on a windowsill, observing everyone's priorities, amused or indifferent. Let's drift back to the farmers for a moment, because their story is, in some ways, the heart of this tale. Yang Ji-fa, one of the first to dig into the pit, eventually became a figure of public curiosity, but not immense wealth. While international scholars and enthusiasts marveled at the craftsmanship, he and his colleagues received small stipends, symbolic tokens, and a modest house in recognition of their discovery. It's not exactly the treasure chest you might expect after finding an entire buried army. Life continued: chickens, rice paddies, the occasional visit from a curious historian. The clay soldiers had become a global sensation, but the hands that first brushed their surfaces remained largely unseen, gently fading into the background of this sprawling story. And if we drift a little further, it's worth noting that this discovery occurred in a period of China's history that was politically tense and tightly controlled. The Cultural Revolution had only recently subsided, and information about the past was carefully curated. Releasing details of a massive imperial tomb could be politically tricky. So while today we enjoy images, documentaries, and 3D reconstructions, back then the government preferred to quietly excavate, catalog, and study, keeping the world largely in the dark. You might notice, if you're still awake or floating gently toward sleep, that this story is as much about people as it is about clay. The terracotta army is silent, stoic, and perfectly still, but the humans around it are messy, complicated, and surprisingly mundane. Farmers, bureaucrats, scholars, and even modern tourists, all weaving in and out of this tale. It's a story that is both monumental and intimate, quiet and slowly sweeping, much like the slow exhalation of a long evening. Let's meander through a few more subtle details about the army itself, because there's something soothing about imagining ancient craftsmanship performed with patience and care. These figures are not only individually sculpted, but also originally painted in vivid colors: red, green, blue, black, gold, though most of it has long since faded. Imagine a rainbow army designed to stand guard for eternity, slowly muted by time and soil. It's a gentle meditation on impermanence, on how even what is meant to last forever will change, fade, and eventually reveal itself to the patient observer. And here's a tiny, almost comical aside. Some of the weapons found with the soldiers were surprisingly advanced. Crossbows, bronze swords, spears, they were functional, but still not used in battle. It's as if the emperor wanted the option of violence in the afterlife, but preferred a quieter, more controlled existence in reality. The soldiers, forever poised and frozen, embody that quiet tension between potential action and eternal stillness. We can also float over to the excavation process itself. The pits were enormous. Horses and chariots, generals and infantry arranged in formations that mirror real-life military strategy. Archaeologists, often working painstakingly slowly, revealed layer after layer, as though peeling back time itself. Tools moved with deliberate care. Brushes swept gently over clay faces. Each piece uncovered was meticulously catalogued. And yet, as serene as this process sounds, it carried with it the silent weight of human ambition, governmental control, and unspoken stories of the farmers who first stumbled into this subterranean world. Let's return quietly to those dusty fields of Shanxi, where the first farmers had unknowingly stumbled onto a hidden empire of clay. The discovery, as monumental as it was, had yet to reach the world outside the province. And in those initial years, the government's approach was careful, slow, and meticulous. Officials wanted to study, document, and control the narrative, while the farmers themselves were caught in the subtle tension between local curiosity and national secrecy. Yang Zhifa and his colleagues were asked, politely but firmly, to avoid discussing what they had found. Some sources suggest they were promised compensation, some suggest they were warned about talking too freely. It's a gentle reminder that history is rarely just about events. It's about the humans who witness them, their choices, their limitations, and the quiet ways they adapt when monumental discoveries brush against their ordinary lives. The excavation itself began in earnest, though not with the speed one might imagine. The first pits revealed row upon row of clay soldiers, horses, and chariots, each painstakingly preserved under centuries of earth. Archaeologists worked slowly, brushing away centuries of soil, noting every detail, every subtle difference in posture, every fragment of a paint layer that had survived against the odds. Some of the soldiers had been buried with inscriptions, names, or markings, hinting at the artisans who had crafted them and the meticulous organization of Qin Shi Huang's imperial ambition. As time passed, the story of the Terracotta Army gradually seeped into the public consciousness, though carefully filtered. International scholars were eventually allowed to study the site. Journalists began to report cautiously, and photographs emerged showing rows of clay soldiers, silent, imposing, and impossibly detailed. By the 1980s, the world began to marvel, as if awakening to a long-forgotten dream. But the farmers who first found the army were not immediately embraced by this global fascination. They lived quieter lives, returning to their routines, receiving small recognitions, but rarely the full acknowledgement they might have deserved. There's something almost poetic in this slow unfolding. The clay soldiers, designed for eternity, remained frozen, silent witnesses to human ambition, greed, and oversight. Meanwhile, the humans around them lived transient lives, their contributions quietly noted but rarely celebrated. It's a gentle meditation on the passage of time, on how discovery and fame are not always aligned with effort or presence. One detail worth floating over, softly, is the craftsmanship itself. Each soldier is unique. The generals have stern expressions, the archers a subtle tension in their shoulders, the infantrymen a calm readiness. The horses, once painted and vibrant, now bear the muted tones of centuries underground. Some experts have speculated that over 700,000 workers were involved in constructing this vast mausoleum complex. Imagine the quiet, methodical labor, the repetition, the devotion, the hours spent perfecting figures that would never move, never speak, and yet would outlast generations. It's oddly comforting, in a sleepy, meditative way, to think of human care preserved for millennia. The government's control over the discovery gradually loosened as the army gained international attention. Museums, scholars, and eventually tourists began to engage with the site. But even in the process of public celebration, there's a bittersweet note. The farmers, those first witnesses, lived largely unchanged. Yang Zifa eventually received some modest rewards and a home, yet the fame that would accompany this discovery for the world did not fully reach him or his fellow villagers. The army was celebrated, the story was shared, and history moved forward. But the individuals who unearthed it remained gently in the background, a quiet reminder of the personal costs often hidden behind monumental achievements. Excavations continue even today. Archaeologists have discovered thousands of soldiers, hundreds of chariots, and innumerable weapons. Many of the figures retain traces of original pigments, evidence that Qin Shi Huang envisioned a colorful, lifelike army. The site itself is enormous, spanning multiple pits over acres of land. Visitors can now walk among the soldiers, observing their stoic expressions, the meticulous details of armor, and the infinite patience embedded in clay. Yet it's also a place where one can quietly reflect on the layers of history, bureaucracy, and human experience that lie just beneath the surface. It's worth considering, in this slow drift toward the end of our story, that the Terracotta Army is not just a testament to an emperor's ambition. It's a mirror of the human condition, our desire to be remembered, our devotion to craft, and the gentle tension between recognition and obscurity. The soldiers, eternally silent, remind us that permanence is possible, but fame and acknowledgement are often fleeting. The farmers remind us that discovery is rarely a fair exchange, and the government's careful oversight reminds us that history is shaped as much by those who study it as by those who create it. As we float toward the quiet conclusion of this story, it's also appropriate to note the subtle, almost sleepy lessons embedded here. Time moves slowly, and yet it moves relentlessly. The past remains beneath the surface, waiting for patient hands to uncover it. Human ambition in its many forms can create monuments, bureaucracies, and stories that stretch far beyond individual lifespans. And sometimes the quietest observers, the farmers, the small participants, the unnoticed witnesses, carry the truest weight of history, even if only in the memories they leave behind. So as we gently close this chapter of sleepy history, picture the farmers walking home at dusk, their hands still a little dusty, their minds quietly burdened with knowledge they could not fully share. Picture the soldiers, row upon row, frozen in clay, painted in muted tones, eternally standing guard. And picture yourself, perhaps, lying back, letting the steady rhythm of centuries wash over you, a calm reminder that history is vast, slow, and infinitely intricate. Good night. Let the soldiers stand silently, the farmers rest peacefully, and let your mind drift gently among the layers of history that wait patiently for those willing to notice. Sleep well, and perhaps dream of clay armies, ancient emperors, and the quiet persistence of time.